Welcome, everybody, to the start of the Center on the Future of War Spring Speaker Series. We're thrilled today to have Philip Bennett, who is an ASU Future Security Fellow at New America. Now, those of you who are familiar with our center in this particular position know that ASU supports several of the national fellows at New America each year. They're called ASU Future Security Fellows at New America. This is a very competitive fellowship. We have 300 plus applicants each year for around 15 of those slots, and we're thrilled to start off our series with Philip's presentation of an upcoming book. It's called The Face of War: How Anthony Shadid Changed Reporting on Conflict After 9/11. So for those of you, again, joining us who aren't familiar with our center, the Center on the Future of War is a presidential initiative at ASU. It's a partnership between Arizona State University and New America, a DC-based think tank. We work on research of a variety of different issues. We're putting out various white papers and books and other kinds of outputs. We also do education, teaching, particularly our Emmy in global security, which is online, and all sorts of outreach efforts, including the Spring Speaker Series, which you're joining us here with today. So Philip Bennett is a journalist, a documentary film producer, and a teacher. He's produced over 20 films on American politics and national security issues for PBS documentary series Frontline, including America After 9/11, America's Great Divide from Obama to Trump, and the Emmy Award-winning The Choice 2016 and The Choice 2020. Bennett is a former managing editor at the Washington Post and was the assistant managing editor for Foreign News. He was a foreign correspondent for the Boston Globe in Latin America in the 1980s. And until 2020, he was the Patterson Professor of Journalism and Public Policy at Duke University. So really briefly, before Phil begins his presentation, just a little housekeeping. We will, after he speaks, we'll do a Q&A and just ask all of you to type your questions into the Q&A box in Zoom, and then I'll play the role of moderating the discussion. And please feel free to ask any and all questions. And without further ado, Phil, welcome so much. Thanks so much for joining us, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Great. Well, thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much. I'm grateful to you and to the Center on the Future of War and ASU for the invitation, and grateful to those of you who are joining us today. I look forward to our discussion over the hour. So I'm going to talk for a few moments about a work in progress. So much of a work in progress that it doesn't have a title yet. So the title of this talk is part of that work in progress. So this is something that I still, because I'm working on it, I still have more questions than answers, and even some of the questions feel a little bit half-baked. So we're going to explore some of those today. The subject, as Daniel mentioned, is Anthony Shadid. And Heather, could you put up the two photographs? I just want to put a picture of Anthony up here for those of you who haven't seen him or don't know who he is or don't know him. This is Anthony at kind of two bookends of his career. On the right, he's in Najaf in Iraq in 2003, just after the U.S. invasion, period we're going to be talking about today. And on the left is a classic kind of Shadid pose, talking to someone in Egypt just after the Arab Spring in 2011. So I wanted just to fix an image of him in your mind while we talk about him over the next bit. So Anthony was perhaps the most celebrated foreign correspondent of his generation. He was the winner of 2 Pulitzers and many other prizes. He was the author of a definitive work about the Iraq War, which we'll talk about in a minute. And he was idolized by many of his colleagues and admired by readers for his really singular ability to express the human dimension within the upheaval in the Middle East in the decade after 9/11. And that's where the title of this talk comes from. He really revealed the human face of war. And the main question I want to put before us today, and one that I and my co-author of this book, Steve Fainaru, are wrestling with as we write about Anthony's life and work, is what did it really matter that he did this? And what are the lessons of his work for us today? Before I add some context to that question, I'll give you a little bit more background. And because this month marks the 20th anniversary of the start of the US invasion of Iraq, I'm going to focus my remarks on Anthony's reporting during that first period, during March, April, and the months to follow of 2003. And I'll start with a story about him that took place on the eve of the invasion in March of 2003. I was at home near Washington, D.C., when the phone rang at about 3 a.m. And it was Anthony calling from Baghdad. He was on his first assignment for the Washington Post, where he'd just been hired. I was the editor in charge of international coverage, and I'd recruited him to the newspaper, but I didn't know him very well. The previous day, the Post had decided to withdraw its 3 correspondents from Iraq for their own safety. As I stood in the dark of my study, Anthony said to me, he began the conversation by saying, "You can fire me, but I'm not leaving. I feel like I've been preparing for this my entire life." And I remember him pausing and then saying, "Really, Phil, I'm begging you, I'm going to stay." It was a pretty audacious move for a new hire, and it worked. In fact, it worked for everyone. In the weeks that followed, Anthony wrote with intimacy, nuance, and meticulously observed detail about families and individuals in Baghdad living through the first phase of the war. By April 9th, when the statue of Saddam Hussein fell, he had written 24 front-page stories in the Washington Post over 20 days. Those stories transformed him nearly overnight from a well-respected, but in his 30s, not very well-known reporter into the most admired American journalist in Iraq. They were part of a package that made him the first American journalist to win a Pulitzer Prize for reporting on a US military intervention from the receiving end. So, what made Shadid's stories in Iraq during those days so special? I think a few examples can capture that. Just a few days after the invasion began, Anthony escaped from his government minder and went for lunch in the home of a Sunni family in an affluent Baghdad neighborhood. He'd met the father, who was a former diplomat, on a previous trip to Iraq. These were people who loathed Saddam Hussein. But in dialogue across the table, the sounds of bombs in the background, Anthony described emotions that were in stark contrast to the jubilation and gratitude that US officials had forecast for Iraqis. Instead, there was a profound sense of loss, confusion, and foreboding. The mother of the family said, "We're in a dark, dark tunnel." A few days later, Shadid wrote about an entirely different family. Karima Salman was a widow raising 8 children by selling chewing gum on the streets. Her son, a soldier, had just left for the front. Anthony sat in their threadbare apartment, which had no running water, listening to Karima's hopes and fears. His relationship with the family would last the rest of his life. One of Karima's daughters, 13-year-old Amal, was keeping a diary of the war that Anthony would later excerpt in the Post and in his book, Night Draws Near. Here's how Anthony wrote about Amal and her extraordinary journal, A Young Girl's Experience of War. "Every time there is quiet, I feel more afraid," she wrote in one passage. "After the quiet ends, we don't know what will happen." As the days passed, her family asked again and again when the bombing would end and when it would begin again. Nights were sleepless. As the war dragged on, the air raid sirens became more disorienting. Did they signal the beginning or the end of an attack? It was hard to keep track. Outside, sandstorms cloaked the sun in hues of red, brown, and sickly yellow. Quote, "The weather is like heaven's anger on the land and the people," Amal wrote in another passage. We don't know what's going to happen. Maybe it's a big catastrophe. At 11:30, the building was shaking and it almost collapsed. You can't imagine the fear and panic. We thought these were our last moments alive and we were about to die. But God saved us. We implored him every day. Praise and thanks to God. End quote. It was another Iraqi teenager who was the subject of perhaps Anthony's most striking story during these days. As he cruised around Baghdad, Anthony happened upon a funeral procession. He stopped, got out of the car, and accompanied the mourners inside a neighborhood mosque. This was the lead of his front page story in the Post the next morning. On a cold concrete slab, a mosque caretaker washed the body of 14-year-old Arkan Daif for the last time. With a cotton swab dipped in water, he ran his hand across Daif's olive corpse, dead for 3 hours, but still glowing with life. He blotted the rose-red shrapnel wounds on the soft skin of Daif's right arm and right ankle with the poise of practice. Then he scrubbed his face scabbed with blood, left by a cavity torn in the back of Daif's skull. The men at the Iman Ali Mosque stood somberly waiting to bury a boy who, in the words of his father, was, quote, like a flower. Haider Khatim, the caretaker, asked, "What's the sin of the children? What have they done?" Again, these were daily news stories reported during days of chaos and written under deadline pressure in a cramped and dark room at Baghdad's Palestine Hotel that Anthony shared with a colleague. Recounted today, they may not seem so revolutionary, but in the moment, they were electrifying, especially on the front page of the leading paper in the nation's capital, whose readers included those who planned and were running the war. Shadid's coverage did not so much dissent from the official story as much as it created an entirely different story. It's worth remembering that the invasion of Iraq was one of the most media-saturated military actions in U.S. history. The Pentagon issued 2,700 media credentials before the invasion. About 600 journalists were embedded with U.S. forces, a novel system in which reporters were formally attached to military units and wrote, photographed, and filmed with very few restrictions on what they could see or say. This system produced the dominant picture, usually a soda straw view of the conflict, arriving to U.S. audiences during the, quote, shock and awe phase of the war. In combination with views from podiums in Washington, the embedded journalists, including 13 correspondents and photographers at the Post, told the story through an American lens, often very effectively. Shadid was among some 100 unembedded international journalists who were in Baghdad when the invasion started. Their reporting occurred under the watchful eyes of Iraqi minders assigned by the government. Shadid was not the only reporter trying to write about the lives of common Iraqis, but none achieved what he did. What made Shadid's coverage stand out was not just what he did, but how he did it. He had several advantages. He had learned Arabic as an adult and had reported in the Middle East for the Associated Press and the Boston Globe. Crucially, his government-assigned minder, a man named Nasir Mandawi, became his collaborator and co-conspirator to evade government restrictions, at first giving him wide leeway and eventually leading him to stories and sources. And Anthony had the support of his editors. He was freed from duplicating the stories of others or feeding big roundups and was encouraged to strike out on his own. As his editor, I saw his approach as an essential part of our coverage and perhaps the essential part of what the Post should be reporting. I shared with Anthony the conviction that Iraq's future would not be determined on the battlefield. But there were more important aspects that made his story special. Many of these had to do with Anthony's personality and character. He treated people as individuals and with respect. He was humble, but with an undeniable charisma. People have remembered 20 years later how he leaned into a conversation with a smile and listened with empathy and intensity that was uncanny. It might seem a small thing, but he almost always published the full names of the people he quoted, recording the names even of incidental figures in his stories. The people he interviewed were not extras in a movie produced in Washington. They were protagonists. He described them in detail. Although his stories were what we might call experiential, meaning they were based on what he saw and heard, he was not explicitly in them. They were not about him. One of the effects of this approach was it allowed Anthony to bypass the easy certainties and sure-footed opinions that tend to hijack war coverage. One of the hardest things to admit in journalism is that you don't know what's going on. Shadid turned this apparent weakness into a virtue. When asked to sum up his impression of Baghdad during the early part of the war, he settled on an Arabic word that he translated as, quote, mysterious and ambiguous. His stories were filled with people's doubts, worries, confusion, uncertainty, conflicting facts and feelings, because that was the truth of the moment. He was not trying to divide Iraq into people who either supported the Americans or opposed them, into good guys or bad guys. After the fall of Saddam Hussein and the beginning of the U.S. occupation, Shadid's reporting method brought him back again and again to people and places he had visited before as a way of measuring change and deepening his understanding, of seeing the big picture. Shadid once told a group of college students, the best journalism is sometimes about footnotes when we write something small to say something big. One place where he found such a footnote was a town called Dululiya, north of Baghdad along the Tigris River. Shadid first went there in the summer of 2003 in the wake of a large U.S. military operation called Peninsula Strike that detained about 400 men and women in the town for being Hussein sympathizers, or what were known at the time as former regime elements. Shadid learned that during the raid, U.S. troops had killed a 15-year-old boy. Mourners at his funeral focused their rage on a masked informant who had helped the Americans and whom residents, despite his disguise, identified by his missing thumb and plastic sandals. Sitting under the funeral tent, Shadid asked what would happen to the man. Of course, he'll be killed, one mourner whispered, but not yet. 6 weeks later, Shadid and Nasir Mendawi, who had gone from government minder to Washington Post employee, returned to Dululiya, which was a perilous drive. They discovered on this trip that Dululiya's tribal elders had issued an ultimatum to the informant's father and brother. Kill him, or we will kill your entire family. Shadid began his story this way. 2 hours before the dawn call to prayer, in a village still shrouded in silence, Sabah Kerbul's executioners arrived. His father carried an AK-47 assault rifle, as did his brother. And with barely a word spoken, they led the man accused by the village of working as an informer for the Americans behind a house girded with fig trees, vineyards, and orange groves. The father told Shadid, I have the heart of a father, and he's my son. Even the prophet Abraham didn't have to kill his son. There was no other choice. This was the first of several stories that described the origins of an insurgency in Iraq months before U.S. officials acknowledged publicly that one existed. Once they did, as officials struggled to identify the enemy, Shadid was already deep inside the currents that would feed the coming civil war. When Anthony told me on the eve of the war that he had been preparing his whole life for that moment, I didn't take him literally, but there was truth in it. He had been on a long, deliberate personal journey that led him to Iraq. He'd grown up in Oklahoma City, the son of a prosperous dentist and real estate investor named Buddy Shadid and his wife, Rhonda. Both Buddy and Rhonda had roots in Lebanon, but had embraced the American dream and never looked back. Anthony charted a course back towards his family origins. After time in Cairo and the West Bank, he changed the pronunciation of his name from Shadid to Shadid. He would eventually lovingly restore his ancestral home in southern Lebanon and write a book about the experience. In a certain sense, his personal search for identity ran on a parallel track to the big subject of his journalism, the transformation of the Middle East, the collapse of the old order, and the struggle for a new order to emerge. So perhaps this is a good moment to circle back to the question I asked at the beginning. What did it matter at the time that Anthony Shadid tried to capture the views and experiences of individuals whose lives were torn by war? And what, if anything, does it matter for us today? Some of the answer seems self-evident. This was an act of bearing witness, of giving voice to the voiceless. It was a moral responsibility to recognize and acknowledge the consequences, intended and unintended, of decisions and actions in wartime. To Anthony, this was an important motivation. In a speech early in the Iraq War, he said this: "Perhaps the saving grace of my often maligned profession of journalism is that in the truest meaning of the word, we're tasked with the job of observation. Insights are left to analysts, truths are left to philosophers, the past is best left to historians. What we can do as journalists is see, or perhaps more specifically, bear witness to lives shaped by the horrors of today's world. We chronicle, we tell stories, and as important, we try to understand. Not that we always succeed, we usually don't, but it is our ambition, and in its best, most humble execution, it can be a worthwhile endeavor." Many colleagues and readers were inspired by this example. Anthony had particular impact on a generation of Arab American journalists who saw a path towards describing the Arab world and Arabs with greater depth and nuance. Steve and I also spoke recently with Amal, the author of the diary that I mentioned earlier. She is now 33 years old and living in Baghdad. She said that she had hoped as a 13-year-old that she could share her experiences with others, with a wider world, and to have her voice matter. Anthony enabled that. But as important as bearing witness is by itself, I'd suggest that the impact and importance of Shadid's reporting went further. By listening to people in Iraq and trying to understand their lives, he was able very early to see and describe realities of the country that it would take months, even years, for U.S. officials to identify and accept. What were some of these realities? The first was how the role of religion and faith would shape the fate of the American project. Anthony was one of the first to understand the effect of the invasion, especially on Iraqi Shiites. He was one of the first people to interview Muqtada al-Sadr, who became a very important figure of opposition to the U.S. occupation and its aftermath. And he was the first to interview, in writing, Ayatollah Sistani, the most important figure in Shia Islam, who held an effective veto power over U.S. plans for democratization in Iraq. Shadid could see more clearly than others the limits of an appeal to Iraqi nationalism. Iraqis Anthony listened to often described themselves as Muslims first, Sunni or Shia or Kurds second, and Iraqis third. The collapse of the Hussein regime brought sectarian differences to the fore, often encouraged by U.S. planners who thought a democratic Iraq meant rebalancing power on sectarian terms. They were proven wrong. At the same time, Shadid saw in the opposition to U.S. policies a strong, visceral opposition among all groups to foreign domination. In other words, it didn't matter if the Americans just fine-tuned their plans or did things more competently. To many Iraqis, the presence of U.S. troops was in itself an unbearable offense. This was an unintended consequence of the invasion that never went away. Some U.S. officials at the time followed Shadid's reporting closely. Steve and I spoke recently with Emma Skye, the political advisor to General Ray Odierno and General David Petraeus. She said that usually when top U.S. officials spoke to journalists, they were in broadcast mode. With Anthony, she said, they were in receiving mode. She told us that she felt Anthony had access to insights that intelligence officers could only dream of. This is what she said. I'd be wanting to hear more and more from Anthony about what he'd seen, his understanding. America can hear everything and see everything, she said, but it can't understand much of what it's hearing or seeing. You don't need to hear all that noise. You just have to be able to see and understand what is happening. Anthony had that gift. He was really trying to work out what it was like to be an Iraqi in these circumstances. The story wasn't him. The story wasn't the U.S. military. He was trying to understand people. Shadid saw that individuals, civilians, people matter in war, not in the sense of counterinsurgency doctrine as a prize to be won, but as a source of understanding. This was a practice that Shadid would sustain for the rest of his life. In his coverage of the U.S. withdrawal from Iraq in 2009, for which he'd win his second Pulitzer, he won his first in the year the Americans came and his second in the year they left. In his brilliant coverage after leaving the post for the New York Times of the Arab Spring, during his capture and beating in Libya during the civil strife of 2011, and into Syria, which he considered in some ways to be the most important story of his career, and where he died in February 2012 while sneaking into the country on foot. He died apparently of an asthma attack triggered by horses used by the smugglers who were escorting him and the photographer Tyler Hicks. So often during research for this book, Steve and I have interviewed people from vastly different backgrounds who tell us how much they regret that Anthony is not here today to help us understand what is going on in the Middle East. In this sense, as in many others, his death 10 years ago left a void that hasn't been filled. He left unfinished business. Let me finish my remarks today with his words. Anthony was invited to speak in 2005 in his hometown on the 10th anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing. In his remarks, he tried to connect that event with what he had witnessed in the Middle East. He said that he never considered himself a war correspondent and tried to offer an explanation of what mattered to him. This is what he said. The best journalism, I think, embraces nuance and celebrates it. War, however, leaves little room for those subtleties. How does a journalist convey the ferocity of violence without it losing meaning in a mind-numbing array of adjectives? How do you cover war with distance when, as someone reporting from a city under siege, there is no distance? How do you cover chaos and confusion when words themselves bring order to that anarchy? With only intermittent success, I've tried to capture those lives that are shaped and reshaped in circumstances that have become too familiar to our generation. I've tried not to cover war and terrorism as such, but rather treat them as a backdrop to people's struggle to survive. And time and again, I see instances of heroism, courage, strength, and even beauty amid the horror. And then he talked about the universality of those qualities. When I look back on covering events like the invasion of Baghdad as a correspondent for the Washington Post, I realize how much we have in common in our responses, in what follows those horrific episodes, in what comes after. Fear, loss, grief, incomprehension, and no less powerfully, anger. I wonder if we look inside those tragedies and see not so much politics, not necessarily ideology, not our prejudices, nor our preconceptions. I wonder if we try to look beyond the black and white that dominates our discourse, and in the unsettled, unsure in-between, we see those emotions that we indeed share and that in their own way bring us together. They offer us a means to understand. We see that shared sentiment, that collective response to tragedy and disaster that unites a community most broadly defined. That understanding, I think, is the first step in making times less difficult. And I'll end there, and Daniel, we can take some questions and have a discussion.
Well, thank you so much. That was a especially articulate and beautiful presentation. It surely those are sections from the book. They flow away.
Well, we'll see. We've had a lot of time to think about it, and both Steve Fainaru, my co-author, and I were both obviously colleagues of Anthony and knew him well. Steve worked with him in the Baghdad bureau of the Washington Post. In fact, Steve and Anthony, I believe, are the only American journalists to win Pulitzer Prizes for their reporting from Iraq. And so we each knew Anthony in different ways. And we found that looking at his work and looking at his life has just been given us opportunities to reflect on our own careers and on our own lives and where they intersected with his.
So briefly to everybody out there, if you have a question, please drop it into the question box, and I will play the role of I'm asking those questions. And I'll just start out. I'm curious. There was an enormous amount of reporting of the Iraq War. It's almost hard to believe now, 20 years later, just how inundated the American news audience was with a constancy of reporting about that conflict. And yet, as you point out, so much of the reporting was constrained. Journalists, certainly, maybe not in the very early years, but pretty quickly were operating under incredible security protocols. And I'm wondering, as someone who worked at the Post with Anthony Shadid, was he viewed as a sort of dangerous player out there in the Baghdad streets who wasn't following the protocols that all the rest of those journalists were following?
I think that he, in a certain way, it sounds funny to say it given my remarks of a moment ago, but because there was such a focus on embedded journalists, because this was a point where the military planners and the interests of the military and interests of much of the media coincided. Military planners saw the media as part of the battle space, and they wanted to take advantage of that. And that's why, rather than exclude everybody from the war, they invited people in, sort of keep your friends close and your enemies closer in some ways, but also a genuine effort to have the war covered. And the interest of big media corporations was to provide as much content as possible. This is really the beginning of the internet world as well. And even though we're a little early in 2003, there was an infinite appetite for coverage. And so the more places you could put people, the better. In that context, Anthony kind of flew beneath the radar. I mean, I think that, I know that he reflected on this a lot. And I think it's certainly the case that if the invasion of Iraq had gone as advertised, in other words, Saddam Hussein was deposed, American troops left within a matter of months, democracy, flowered, peace reigned, the Middle East was transformed in a positive way, that he might have looked a little bit pessimistic in his approach to the story. But in fact, he turned out to be right. And, you remember too, that even though there was enormous and, and understandable, traditional kind of patriotism and a wave of good feeling that in the United States that accompanied the beginning of that war, within a very short time, as it became clear that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, that the idea that the country would be an easy kind of cakewalk in terms of its transition to a governable state, it became clear that those things were not true. Public opinion turned very rapidly against that. So, and in that environment, there was a different kind of hunger for information, which was a hunger about what was actually happening there. And many of those journalists who did really good work, positioned with American, fighting units, they weren't in position to answer that question. So, so I don't think that Anthony, suffered from a kind of what we think of as a kind of Vietnam syndrome of, blaming the messenger for the, for the bad news. And in fact, he generally enjoyed, we have found in our research, people in the American military establishment, in the diplomatic establishment, and in the White House at the time when things started to look bad, they were very interested in what he had to say. I think you're on mute.
I was on mute. What I'm curious about is, I spent quite a lot of time in Iraq in those years from 2004 to 2010. And one of the things that was characteristic of the situation after somewhere around early 2004, say March, April, whenever you want to gauge it, the security concerns were so severe among foreigners that people hardly ventured out of these secure areas. And when they did, I give you concrete examples, when they go to visit a development project, an AID worker or somebody from one of these development organizations would show up, in a convoy of hardened vehicles with private security contractors, wearing the full outfits and fully armed in order to talk to, say, a group of women on a micro lending project or something like this. And one of the interesting things that I think really defined Shadid's work was not using those, not engaging, not buying into those security protocols while he was reporting, even during the times when others were petrified of traveling without that degree of security force support.
This is such a great point to have raised, Daniel. I mean, I think it's essential to understanding who he was as a person and also understanding how he was able to talk to the people that he talked to. I imagine people on this call or listening to us now, many people are familiar with conditions in Iraq that, after a certain point, it became very dangerous to operate. There was the Green Zone, and that was a fortified center of U.S. operations. There were military bases, and then the rest of Iraq was kind of the red zone, and it became increasingly perilous to travel around through that. And so journalism organizations adopted unprecedented security measures. I mean, when I was starting out and people of my age covering conflict, we never carried weapons. No one ever carried a weapon or was accompanied by somebody carrying a weapon. Now, I think it's still generally considered that journalists should not carry weapons themselves. But in Iraq, very soon after the period you're describing, the Washington Post bought armored vehicles. We had armed security details that accompanied most of our reporters when they left the bureau to avoid them being kidnapped.
But not Shadid, I guess, right?
But not Shadid. So we had a carve out for Anthony, and he really refused to work that way. He had an old Caprice that was driven by a trusted driver. He had Nasir, his kind of partner in reporting, and they just get in their Caprice and they would go. And they felt, Anthony felt it's better not to attract attention than to attract attention. And as a result, Steve and I, even 20 years later, are rereading stories, reading Anthony's notes, talking to people, and we're just, our mouths are just left open by the degree of risk that he took in going to places on his own, where, and there were instances in which he and Nasir had to leave very, very quickly to avoid some bad outcome. But the result is that, as Emma Skye was saying, Anthony was kind of, he knew more than, an intelligence officer would know working all the time, because he was talking to people and going to places that no other American was in a way that no other American was doing at the time.
Do you know, when he was out in the communities, did he describe himself to those he spoke to as an American, or would he avoid the issue? Do you know?
Yeah, I think that it varied on the circumstances. I mean, he never concealed his identity as a reporter, as far as we know. He pulled out a notebook, he took notes. And I don't know of any instance in which he kind of dissembled and said, no, I'm, from someplace else. But I don't think that was information that, you would volunteer if asked. I mean, he spoke Arabic. I think the other thing, as people have said to us, it just wasn't the Arabic. A lot of people, a certain number of people spoke Arabic. Anthony had a manner about him. He was fascinated with the sort of formalities of courtesy and protocol in the Middle East in general, and Iraq in particular. So he, when approaching people, when talking to people, when sitting with people and drinking tea, while he was reporting, he was very attuned to the social and cultural cues that he needed to give and that he was receiving from people. And I think that opened a lot of doors for him. I mean, people have told us that one thing that Anthony did was, he would sit and listen to somebody for a very long time. A lot of journalists, they're very transactional. They're going to get a quote, they want to get some information, and then they want to leave as quickly as they can. Anthony didn't operate that way. And so he built up trust over time with people. He went to Najaf because he was so interested in the Shia. He went there all the time, and got to know people very well. And so he operated with a certain level of comfort that I don't know of any other American journalist to achieve that level of comfort in those situations.
Interesting. A question here from AJ Germack. All people have personal stories who are experiencing war firsthand, but did Anthony Shadid want the U.S. to feel guilty by trying to introduce democracy in place of a dictatorship or a theocracy?
Well, if you're online, what do you mean by guilty? I'm not sure I understand the question completely. Or Daniel, what do you think that?
Yeah, I don't know either. But let's just perhaps what he's getting at is a sense of responsibility, a sense of failure in the U.S. project. Certainly, those who were embedded with military units wouldn't even encounter that issue, even if they saw the futility of particular operations. Say they weren't hearing from Iraqis what they thought.
Yeah, so I guess I could take that question a couple of ways, and I apologize if I'm misinterpreting the question. So, I don't think that Anthony certainly saw himself as an American, and but he was an Arab American, and he also, as an American, as a journalist, he had an ability to empathize and see things from different people's points of view. And I think he saw as one of his strengths a kind of withholding of judgment of what other people were saying or thinking, either about him or about anything they were talking about. He wanted to know what they thought. And so I think that he maintained a kind of distance from, feeling that he was representing, the United States in some way, or that, for good or for bad. And I don't think, I know that he didn't take pleasure in the failure of the project. I don't think that there was a kind of told you so quality to what he was doing. I think on the issue of democracy, I think this was something that absorbed him his entire career. And we've only talked about a slice of it really here today. But Anthony, by the time the Arab Spring occurs in 2011, Anthony is really almost obsessed, I'd say, with the idea of citizenship in the Arab world. And citizenship not tied to religious faith, not tied to tribe or to sect or to small identity, but tied to some level of community, as he says in the quote that I read, broadly construed. And I think that this is what he felt was the path to a new order in the Middle East, and that had much more democratic features than the ones that he had reported on for most of his career. So I think that he felt himself that he was personally invested in the idea of a Middle East that was transforming itself, it seemed in those moments, towards a freer, more representative, more democratic place. Those hopes were dashed. But I know that when Anthony, I think, would say that, standing in Tahrir Square, in February of 2011 and seeing the protests there, was the way he described it was that the euphoria of that moment washed away so much of the bad taste of Iraq over the previous years. So I think he was engaged with
himself, from his own sensibility, or
yeah, from his own sensibility. I mean, he did said that in a private email to somebody. He didn't write that in a story, but that yes, that he was so since the question was about whether or not his own guilt or towards this or that, I think he did process those emotions. I mean, I think he was as you can tell, he was a deeply thoughtful, soulful person. So even the journalist's role of chronicling the suffering of others and what your own moral responsibility is in those cases, the kind of moral injury that you suffer from, reporting on and in a certain way benefiting from the stories of other people's suffering. I mean, that weighed on him. That was a side effect of his profession that he was aware of and that he thought a lot about.
So the title of your talk is The Face of War, How Anthony Shadid Changed Reporting on Conflict After 9/11. So how do you see his work actually having changed reporting on conflict after 9/11? There's conflict now all over the world. Some are really in the headlines, say Ukraine. To what degree is the reporting on conflict distinct now as a result of his contributions?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't make too many great claims for this title. I mean, I wouldn't say, pick a conflict and I'll show you Anthony Shadid's, thumbprint on it. So I think what that means, what that meant to me when, we were talking about a frame for this talk today, is Anthony Shadid took people who were traditionally marginalized in the coverage of conflicts as being pawns of greater forces, and he moved them from the periphery of the story into the center of the story. And we talked about this, he and I talked about this, at great length over this period about who was really going to be the final arbiter in conflicts in Iraq, but also conflicts in Syria, conflicts elsewhere. And how could you capture the voices, the ideas, the experiences of people who ultimately were going to determine the fate of that conflict? And I think that if you go back to your earlier question about why was, the emphasis on the reporting during especially during the early phase of the Iraq War, it was simple, which was that the most powerful side was going to win, and that the United States had the power in that case, and that the essential conflict was not between Iraqis and Americans. The essential conflict was between one group of Americans who supported the war and another group of Americans who opposed the war, and that's where the real tension was going to be. And as a result, this has always kind of fascinated me that despite all of the coverage that I helped organize, that you were involved in. That 10 years later, there's not a single American who could tell you what Iraqis called the Iraq War, because they didn't call it the Iraq War. It was a completely different experience for them. And by focusing on that experience, by bringing it to the surface, he changed the emphasis and the way of understanding that conflict. And he made it, I think, after 9/11, he took a type of reporting that looked at things through an American lens, and he turned the lens around. And at first he did it almost single-handedly. I think by the end, there were other people who were doing it extremely well as maybe that Anthony did it, but he created a marketplace for that kind of reporting.
Now you were editing his work at the time, is that right?
Yes, at the beginning, yeah.
So what were the real challenges as an editor for his work? Was he difficult to edit? Would he resist your editorial suggestions? What was it like?
Anthony. So Anthony was an extremely gracious, humble, and polite person who often would not do what you told him to do. So because he was also stubborn. And so, as many of us are, you could be lulled into a feeling that this was a person who was going to, do everything he could to try to, please you. But he was very sure about himself and what he wanted to accomplish. And I don't think in our relationship that caused much of a conflict. I mean, to tell you the truth, when we started working together during the invasion, all that needed to happen was for him to feel liberated from some of the conventions of daily journalism. So when the invasion started, he started by writing. He'd worked at the Associated Press. He knew how to write a daily news story. And so he wrote kind of bombs fell on Baghdad today stories. He didn't take much convincing, but I had to tell him, and I had to convince my bosses at the Washington Post that was not the story that he should be doing. And so if there are any journalists on this call, you'll know what a nut graph is, which is generally a paragraph in a newspaper story that summarizes what you're about to be told, and summarizes the importance of the story that you're reading. And in one of Anthony's first stories that he sent from Baghdad, I shocked him a little bit by cutting the nut graph out of the story and telling him that I didn't want him to explain anything to us. I wanted him to show us what he was seeing. And I think that was liberating for him. I think that played to his natural tendencies. And we never had that kind of conversation, ever again. But I think, for the length of his career, the biggest problem that editors had with Anthony was that he wrote long. He was kind of a creature for the internet before there was an internet, because in newspapers, space was a premium. And Anthony, it didn't matter how many rules you tried to impose about story length, he was going to tell you that this story was so important that you needed a couple more inches to get it all done. But he was, I found him to be, I thought he was a joy to work with, and just incredibly, if you were a young journalist trying to understand just the tools of the trade. Anthony spent many years developing those. He was not just a brilliant person who sat down and let it rip. He was incredibly organized, meticulous, and disciplined in his craft. He unloaded his notebooks into his computer every night, meaning that he typed up his notes. He organized his work, his notes incredibly well. And he did something that all journalists promise to do, but very few actually do, which is he went back again and again and again to the same people. And that meant that he knew them very well and they trusted him and he trusted them. And that just enabled him to have insights that other people just didn't have access to.
Now, are you, for writing this book, are you able to read his notebooks or material that exists outside of his reporting that's obviously available to all?
Yes, so we do. His papers at the time of his death were loaned by his widow to the American University of Beirut. And Steve and I have been to Beirut. We've gone through those papers. We have emails and other documents that he saved. His own organizational sense. I don't think it would surprise anybody who knew him that he probably planned one day to write an autobiography. So he had a lot of his material already organized. His notebooks are of kind of limited value because his writing is entirely inscrutable. He developed a kind of shorthand in his notebook, his note-taking that means that you can get some things out of it, but that the notebooks were less valuable to us as a kind of guide. But because he did type them up frequently, we can see how stories developed, how they were changed, how editors changed them, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, do you, one of the striking things about the 20th anniversary coming up for the US invasion of Iraq, I think, is how little the American public cares about the country now. And this is more of a general question, but it used to be the subject of daily coverage by every possible media entity, television, newspapers. There were bureaus of every major, certainly US-based player. It was on everybody's mind. But I do think you're right that most of the reflections on the country were about the US, not about the country itself. So are there any lessons looking back on this incredibly complicated, expensive, devastating war that transformed Iraq for sure, and if not the region, if not the Middle East at large? Are there lessons from this for journalists covering this ground? Because it's striking, you can hardly find a story on Iraq now, and frankly, there's limited engagement of the US and certainly of the American public with the country as it goes through its current stage of crisis.
I mean, it's such an important point. I mean, we could spend a long time exploring this, and it would be worthwhile to do so because the consequences of those actions are real and enduring. I mean, I was struck then, I'm struck now reviewing it. In the case of Iraq, the antipathy towards Iraq and Iraqis from American soldiers, many diplomats, many US officials from the very beginning, as though it was kind of the Iraqis' failures that led to the failure of the American project, and that these were not deserving allies. These were not deserving of and that motif is always so interesting to me because, especially for a conflict that was started or had its origins in U.S. policy planning. Look, I think that it's really hard for something that is as disturbing, and as depressing as the conditions inside Iraq through the period of ISIS, through the period today. It's hard to keep those at the top of mind if you don't have a direct personal connection to it. Today, we're reading about, compassion fatigue with Ukraine, and people becoming much less interested in Ukraine after a period in which, in certain parts of the country, you would see Ukrainian flags, fixed to people's buildings and houses and stuff like that. So I think that's a natural tendency. The second part of your question about what would you say to journalists, I think one of the lessons of Anthony is go beneath that story of for or against, pro and con, winning and losing, good or bad, and get down to the level at where people actually live, which in many cases is a cultural level. So Anthony was, obsessed with the music of Iraq, the food of Iraq, the poetry of Iraq, the history of Iraq. He wrote a wonderful story about the bookseller's street in Baghdad, about the bridges of Baghdad and how they came to be. And you'd learn more from that story about the bridges about why Iraq was the way it was than through dozens of kind of political military proclamations about the state of the country. So I think that forming those kinds of connections, which really is a pathway to understanding, and understanding is a pathway to a more enduring connection, whether or not you feel that it's your personal responsibility to keep up with events there, it creates a grounding and it's true, Daniel, in all of these conflicts. I think about Central America, where I started, where I'm sure every war correspondent in Bosnia, in Chechnya, feels the same thing, that the parade moves on, and those places are forgotten. The way that they're remembered is through the lives of people and those really kind of deeply held, shared and common aspirations that you have with people that are formed through culture and other ways. And so I think coverage that dwells on that expands our understanding of it is a way to address that issue.
A final question here from Sabrina Perella. Given his affinity for curiosity and empathy, could this be replicated, or is this a quality that you either have or you don't? I think a useful question for us as a university, which of course has a big journalism school, is this, what do you think of that in your reporting and studying on Anthony Shadid's career?
Well, I think it takes courage to be empathetic. And those are personal qualities. I also think, Anthony was operating in extreme conditions, and obviously he suffered for it. His life was cut short because of his commitment to doing a certain kind of story. I think for journalism and life more generally, writing of any kind, empathy is a cardinal virtue, and it's an essential skill. And you really can't perform well in so many professions, and journalism among them, without that empathy. I think if you were to list all the things that you don't like about journalism today, many of them could be cured or at least improved by a deeper, more conscious sense of empathy. So I do think it's maybe there are natural traits that make somebody like that. I think he had a particular gift for it, but it's also a skill and an ability, a sensibility that can be cultivated.
So what a great place to end our presentation. The idea that empathy is a skill, something that could be learned, something maybe our universities could take the lead on in teaching. Thank you so much, Phil Bennett, for joining us. Thank you, all of you, for spending a little time with us this evening. Our next speaker will be Kamir Kidia, who is our other ASU Future Security Fellow this year. His title of his talk is Trauma and Empire, Uprooting Psychiatry from its Colonial Origins. He's going to be speaking to us from 10 to 11 in the morning, Arizona time, because he's based now in Zimbabwe. He's a physician and anthropologist, a former Rhodes Scholar, who is investigating the ways in which the psychiatric model has served to kind of enable a colonial mentality. And we hope you can join us for that talk. And again, Phil, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.